The mailman's name was Curtis Eller. He had worked the same route in Callaway County, Kentucky for 19 years, which meant he had delivered mail to the house at 14 Sycamore Bend Road for 19 years, which meant he had known Arthur Pace for 19 years in the specific and limited way that a mailman knows the people on his route. He knew Arthur's schedule. He knew that Arthur was always up before 7 because the porch light was always off by the time Curtis arrived, which meant Arthur had been up long enough to turn it off and move through his morning. He knew that Arthur took the newspaper from the box at the end of the drive and carried it inside and read it at the kitchen table because on the mornings when Curtis was running, early he sometimes saw Arthur at the window with the paper open in front of him. He knew that Arthur waved when he saw the truck, a small wave. The wave of a man who was not naturally demonstrative, but had decided that acknowledging people was the right thing to do. He had known these things about Arthur Pace for 19 years, and he had never known until the morning of November 14th that Arthur had a son. He found out because of what was on the porch. He had pulled up to the mailbox at the end of the drive that morning and put in the usual bundle: a utility bill, a seed catalog, a circular from the pharmacy in Murray. He had looked up at the house the way he always did, a habit of 19 years, the kind of automatic attention that becomes part of the job after long enough. The porch light was on. It was 9:40 in the morning. It should not have been on. He sat in the truck for a moment looking at it. Then he looked at the porch itself. There was something on the porch that had not been there the day before. It was a package, a brown paper parcel about the size of a shoebox sitting beside the front door. He could see from the truck that it had postage on it, which meant it had not come through him, which meant it had been delivered by someone else or left there by someone who was not the Postal Service. He could also see from the truck that it was sitting in a way that suggested it had been there for some time. The morning had been damp, and the paper had a quality of having absorbed some of that damp. Curtis was not a man who involved himself in other people's business. 19 years on a mail route had given him a clear understanding of where his responsibilities began and ended, and the beginning and ending of those responsibilities did not generally include climbing other people's porch steps to investigate packages that were not his to deliver. But the porch light was on at 9:40 in the morning, and Arthur Pace had never in 19 years left his porch light on past sunrise. And something in the combination of those two facts moved Curtis out of his truck and up the drive. He knocked on the front door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. He tried the bell, which produced a sound from inside the house, a clear ring that proved the electricity was on, that the house was not simply dark and empty. No answer. He stood on the porch for a moment. He looked at the package beside the door. It was addressed to Arthur Pace, 14 Sycamore Bend Road, Callaway County, Kentucky. The return address was a name he did not recognize and a city in Oregon he had never been to. The handwriting was young, he thought, which was not a precise observation, but was the only word that came to him for it. The handwriting of someone who had not yet settled into the hand they would have at the end of their life. He called the non-emergency line for the Callaway County Sheriff's Department from his truck. He explained the situation in the careful and factual way of a man who understood that he might be overreacting and wanted to be clear about what he knew versus what he was inferring. The dispatcher said she would send someone to check. Curtis sat in his truck and waited because it seemed like the right thing to do. Because he had known Arthur Pace for 19 years, and because the porch light was on. The deputy who arrived was a young man named Garrett, who took the situation seriously without making it more than it was. He knocked, announced himself, got no response, and after a brief consultation with his dispatcher, used the authority available to him in welfare check situations to enter the house. He was inside for 4 minutes. When he came back out, his face had the particular quality of a young man who has just seen something he will not forget. Arthur Pace had died in his armchair in the front room. The deputy said it appeared to be natural causes, that he looked peaceful, that he was fully dressed as if he had sat down after breakfast and simply not gotten back up. The coroner would later confirm that he had died of cardiac arrest sometime in the early morning hours. He was 78 years old. He had lived alone at 14 Sycamore Bend Road for 11 years. Since his wife Maren had died of the same cause in the same county, though in a hospital rather than an armchair. Curtis gave his information to the deputy and drove the rest of his route. He thought about Arthur Pace at the window with the newspaper. He thought about the small wave. He thought about the package on the porch with the young handwriting on it. He thought about it for the rest of the day. The package stayed in the back of his mind the way certain things do, not urgently, not intrusively, but with a quiet persistence. He did not know why. He had known people on his route who died. It happened over 19 years more often than he would have liked. Each time it was its own kind of loss, small and private, the loss of a familiar thing that would not be replaced. But this felt different, and he did not know exactly why until he was eating dinner that evening and his wife Paulette asked him what was wrong, and he told her about the porch light and the package and the young handwriting, and she said that sounds like it was from his son, and something settled into place when she said it. Yes, that was what it had felt like. Something sent by someone young to someone old, arriving at a door that could no longer open. What Curtis did not know, and what no one in Callaway County knew because Arthur Pace had not been a man who shared the private architecture of his life, was the story of Thomas Pace. Thomas was 44 years old. He lived in Portland, Oregon, where he worked as a high school history teacher and coached junior varsity soccer, and lived in a rented house near the river with a cat named Horace and a kitchen that needed the backsplash replaced. He had been in Portland for 16 years. He had left Kentucky at 28 after a period of his life that he did not discuss in detail with most people, a period that had included a marriage that did not survive its third year and a period of drinking that had lasted longer than the marriage and a slow and difficult emergence from both of those things that had eventually deposited him in Portland, which he had chosen for no particular reason except that it was far from Kentucky and had seemed, at the time, like far was what he needed. He had not called his father during the worst of it. This was the fact he had lived with longest, the one that had not softened with time the way some of the other facts had. He had not called because calling would have required explaining, and explaining would have required admitting, and admitting had not been something he was capable of in those years. He had gone silent instead, the way a person goes silent when silence feels like the only available protection, not understanding or not caring in those years. That silence was also a choice that affected other people. Arthur had not called either after the first year. Thomas had expected, somewhere in the back of the place where he kept things he did not examine closely, that his father would keep calling, that a father's persistence would outlast a son's silence, that eventually the phone would ring and the reckoning would happen whether he was ready or not. But Arthur had called for a year and then stopped. Thomas had interpreted this at the time as his father giving up on him. He had spent several years interpreting it that way. It had taken him a long time, and a therapist in Portland named Dr. Reeves, who did not let him get away with easy interpretations, to understand that what his father had done was something different and more complicated than giving up. Arthur Pace had been raised by a man who believed, in the specific way of men of his generation in that part of Kentucky, that the right response to someone who needed space was to give them space, even when the space became distance, even when the distance became years. He had called for a year because calling felt right. He had stopped calling because Thomas had not answered, and Arthur had concluded, in the way of a man who did not examine his conclusions closely enough, that not answering meant not wanting to be called. He had sat with that conclusion for 15 years, and had not examined it the way it needed to be examined, and had, in the silence, missed his son in a way that was constant and quiet, and that he had told no one about because telling people was not something he did. Thomas had gotten sober at 32. He had found the teaching job at 33. He had found Portland, which turned out to be exactly the right distance, at 28, and had found therapy, which turned out to be what the distance had been buying time for at 31. He had, across the years of his 30s, rebuilt himself in the patient and unglamorous way that rebuilding actually works, one decision and one day and one small kept promise at a time. He had learned, slowly, that the self he had been running from was not the self he was running toward, that the drinking had been a way of not being in his own life, and that being in his own life, fully and without the buffer of substances, was the only way forward that had ever existed. By 40, he was stable in a way he had not been since his 20s, stable in the deep sense of having a self he recognized and could rely on, a self that had opinions about backsplash tile and worried about his students and got up on Saturday mornings and ran along the river and felt, most days, like someone he did not mind being, and then he had started thinking about his father, not for the first time. He had thought about his father throughout his 30s, in the particular way you think about something you are not ready to address, circling it, approaching and retreating, letting the therapist push on it, and then deflecting and then coming back. But at 40, the thinking had changed quality. It had become less about what had happened and more about what was still possible. He had understood, sitting across from Dr. Reeves on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 2 years before the package, that the window was not infinite. His father was 76. His father's health, as far as Thomas knew, was adequate for a man of 76, but Thomas did not actually know because Thomas had not asked, because Thomas had not called. The window was not infinite, and Thomas had been treating it as if it were. He had written a letter. This was where he began, not with a phone call, because the phone felt like too much too fast, because the silence had been long enough that the reconnection needed to happen on paper first, where the words could be chosen slowly and the space between sending and receiving allowed for whatever needed to happen on the other end. He had written a letter and sent it to the address he still had memorized, 14 Sycamore Bend Road, and he had waited. Arthur had received the letter. He had read it at the kitchen table on a morning in November 2 years before his death. He had read it twice. He had set it down and looked at it for a long time. Then he had taken out a piece of paper and begun to write back. He had written several drafts over several days. He had sent the reply. What followed was 2 years of letters. Not emails, not texts, letters, because Thomas had begun with a letter and Arthur had responded in kind, and neither of them had moved to any other medium because the letters were working, and changing the medium felt like a risk neither of them wanted to take. They wrote about ordinary things at first. Thomas wrote about Portland, about the school, about his students, about Horace the cat. Arthur wrote about the farm, about the neighbors, about the county, about the small repairs and seasonal tasks that organized a retired man's life. They wrote around the years of silence without writing about it directly. The way you move around a large piece of furniture in a small room, acknowledging it by navigating it without addressing it head-on. Over time, they moved closer to it. Thomas wrote in the spring of the first year about getting sober. He wrote it plainly and without self-pity, the way he had learned to write about it in therapy, as a fact about his history rather than a claim on anyone's sympathy. Arthur wrote back and said he had wondered, and that he was glad Thomas had found his way through it. He wrote that he should have called more. Thomas wrote back and said he should have answered. The letter that came back from Arthur after that one took 3 weeks, longer than usual, and when it arrived it was 4 pages, the longest Arthur had ever written. And it said things that Arthur Pace had never said out loud to anyone about missing his son and about the years of silence and about the particular way a man of his upbringing did not know how to ask for the thing he most needed, which was simply to know that his son was alive and finding his way. Thomas had read that letter, sitting at his kitchen table in Portland with Horace on the chair beside him, and he had understood for the first time what the silence had cost his father, not what it had cost himself, which he had understood for years, but what it had cost Arthur. He had understood that the silence had not been his alone to bear, that he had handed half of it to a man who had not known how to put it down. He had written back. He had kept writing. The letters continued through the 2nd year, more regularly now, sometimes 2 in a month. Thomas had started thinking about visiting. He had mentioned it in a letter in the spring. Arthur had written back and said he would like that. They had not yet set a date. Thomas had been planning to set a date soon. He had been meaning to call, which felt possible now in a way it had not for a long time, to hear his father's voice, to move from paper to phone in the careful progression of 2 people, rebuilding something that had been damaged by years and silence and the specific mutual failure of men who do not know how to say what they need. He had sent the package instead of calling in October as a beginning, a package with things in it that he thought his father might like, a book about Kentucky history that he had found at a shop in Portland and thought Arthur would enjoy, a photograph of himself that was recent and that showed him as he actually was now, the person he had become in the years his father had not seen. A letter that was longer than the others, and that said things he had been building towards saying for 2 years. He had sent it with a note on the outside of the wrapping that said, "Call me when this arrives," with his phone number, because he was ready now to hear his father's voice. The package had arrived on the porch of 14 Sycamore Bend Road on the morning of November 14th. The damp had gotten into the brown paper. The porch light had been on. The sheriff's deputy, Garrett, had found the package when he came out of the house and had taken it inside and set it on the kitchen table, which was the right thing to do and which was what led to what happened next. When the county contacted Arthur's next of kin, the only name they had was Thomas Pace in Portland, Oregon, found in an address book in Arthur's desk drawer. They called the number in the address book. Thomas answered on the second ring. He drove. He did not fly because flying felt wrong, felt too fast, felt like it would not give him enough time to absorb what was happening on the way to where he was going. He drove from Portland to Callaway County, Kentucky in a rental car over 2 days, through Oregon and Idaho and Wyoming and the long, flat middle of the country, and then into the rolling hills of Kentucky, and he thought about his father the whole way. He thought about the voice he had not heard in 16 years, whether he would have recognized it if the call had come through, whether the voice of a man of 78 sounded like the voice of a man of 62 in any way that a son could locate and hold on to. He did not listen to the radio. He did not call anyone. He drove and thought and let the miles do what miles do when you need time to become ready for what is at the end of them. He thought about the letters. He thought about the 4-page letter in the spring of the first year. He thought about the package on the porch. He thought about the note on the outside that said, "Call me when this arrives," and about what it meant that the package had arrived and the call had not been possible. He arrived at 14 Sycamore Bend Road on a Tuesday evening. The county had a neighbor, a woman named Dot Hargis, who had lived 2 houses down for 30 years, holding a key. Dot met him at the door. She was in her late 70s, a small, precise woman who had brought food to Arthur twice a week for the past 3 years, and who looked at Thomas with the specific assessment of someone deciding whether he deserved to be standing on this porch. He must have passed the assessment because she handed him the key and said the package was on the kitchen table, and that Arthur had been a good man, and she hoped Thomas knew that. He said he did. She nodded and went back to her house. Thomas stood in the house his father had lived in for 30 years, 22 of which Thomas had not visited. He stood in the front room and looked at the armchair where his father had died. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked to the kitchen. The package was on the table. It had been opened. He stood over it and looked inside, and understood that someone, the deputy or a county official, had opened it looking for identifying information and had left the contents inside. The book was there. The photograph was there. The letter was there, still folded. He picked up the letter and held it. It had not been read. The fold was the same fold he had made in Portland when he sealed it. His father had not read it because his father had not been there when it arrived. He set the letter down. He looked around the kitchen. On the small table against the wall, held down by a salt shaker, was an envelope with his name on it. He did not recognize the context at first, did not immediately understand what he was looking at. He picked it up. It was sealed. His name was on the front in his father's handwriting. He opened it. Inside was a single page, folded once. Arthur had written it in August, 3 months before he died, which Thomas would later understand meant that Arthur had known something was not right with his health in August, had suspected something, and had sat down and written this in August without telling Thomas, in the same way that Arthur did most things, quietly and without announcement, with the specific self-sufficiency of a man who had lived alone for 11 years and had become practiced at handling his own affairs. The letter said, "Thomas, I have been thinking about what I want to say if something happens before we get to say it in person. I am not a man who is good at this kind of writing, so I am going to keep it short and hope the short version carries what the long version would have said. I am proud of you. Not of the things you have done, though those are fine, but of the person you found your way back to being. I know what it cost you. I watched from farther away than I should have been, and I saw it anyway. You came back to yourself. That is the hardest thing there is. I should have called more when you were not answering. I told myself I was giving you space. I was also afraid of what I would hear and what I would not know how to say back. That is the truth of it. I am sorry for the years. I am glad for the letters. If you are reading this because I did not make it to the visit we keep meaning to plan, I want you to know that I was planning it too. I had cleared the guest room. Your mother's quilt is on the bed. Come anyway. The house is yours. Come and stay as long as you need. I love you. Dad. Thomas sat down at the kitchen table. He sat there for a long time. He did not cry immediately. He read the letter a second time and a third time, and then he folded it and held it, and the fourth time he read it was when he was holding it closed. Not reading the words, but knowing what they said. And that was when something gave way that had been held tight for a very long time. He stayed in the house for 2 weeks. He sorted through what needed to be sorted, made the arrangements that needed making, spoke to the county and the funeral home and the attorney who had handled Arthur's modest estate. He spoke to Dot Hargis every day, sometimes on her porch with coffee in the cold, sometimes at his father's kitchen table. She told him that Arthur had mentioned him often in the last 2 years, more than in the years before that. That something had shifted in Arthur and she had assumed it was age, but now she understood it had been the letters. She said Arthur had seemed lighter. She said that was the word she kept coming back to. Lighter. Like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a long time. Thomas had to look at the yard when she said that. He slept in the guest room under his mother's quilt every night of those 2 weeks. He read the 2 years of letters his father had kept in a box in the desk drawer, tied with a rubber band. All of them, including Thomas's own letters returned to him now from the other side of the correspondence. His own words in his own handwriting, received back across a distance that no longer existed in the same way. On the last morning before he drove back to Portland, he sat on the porch in the November cold with a cup of coffee. The yard was bare, the sycamore at the end of the drive leafless, the road empty. He thought about Curtis Eller, the mailman, who had come forward to tell Thomas what he had noticed that morning. The porch light on at 9:40, the package damp on the step. The 19 years of knowing that porch light was never on that late, and how that knowing had moved him out of his truck and up the drive. Thomas had called him to say thank you. Curtis had been quiet for a moment and then said he was just doing what seemed right, that Arthur had been on his route for 19 years and that 19 years of small waves adds up to something. Thomas had said that was the thing, that was exactly the thing. That the small, consistent acts of acknowledgement between people, the waves and the nods and the noticing, were not small at all. They were the whole fabric of it. He thought about his father in the armchair. He thought about the guest room cleared and the quilt laid out and a visit planned in his father's mind that had not made it into words before the words became impossible. He thought about the window that is not infinite. He thought about the package he had sent with the note that said, "Call me when this arrives," and about the call that had not come, and about the letter on the kitchen table that had arrived first. That had been waiting for him instead. Before you go, I want to sit with you in what this story is actually about. Not the death, though that is real and it matters. Not even the letters, though they are the heart of it. This story is about a window. The window between two people who have hurt each other and gone silent and are finding their way back. Thomas found the window in time to write the letters. He did not find it in time to make the visit. He found the letter on the kitchen table instead of hearing his father's voice. That is the shape of this particular story, and it is an honest shape, not a clean one, because most real things are not clean. But here is what is also true. The letters existed. The 2 years of letters existed. The 4-page letter in the spring existed. The guest room had been cleared. The quilt was on the bed. His father knew. Thomas had gotten back in time for that, if not for everything. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life the window is still open for? Someone you have been meaning to call, meaning to write, meaning to visit? Tell me, And then when you are done telling me, go do it. Not tomorrow. Today. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.